Usually, when people discuss the old God of War games, they talk about the action, the combat system, the violence, and with good reason. At the time of its release back in 2005 on the PlayStation 2, God of War had one of the most cinematic, the most fluid, and yes, one of the bloodiest and most brutal combat systems of any action game ever. Nowadays, of course, just about every action game has a fluid, fast-paced cinematic combat system. There's nothing special about that anymore. It's what players have come to expect. In the year 2025, basically every action game has caught up to what God of War was doing 20 years ago. But the action is only half the story, because God of War is not just an action game, it is an action-adventure game. And I think that adventure half is what makes it truly special, what makes it still stand out in a very crowded space of similar titles. The adventure elements are the reason why God of War, despite a lot of jankiness and clunkiness and age, still stands the test of time. There is a moment, about a third of the way into the game, where our protagonist, angry, miserable anti-hero Kratos, is given a quest. He is told to depart to the burning city of Athens, to journey through the mystical, monster-infested Desert of Lost Souls, where he will find the wandering titan Kronos, a massive, massive being who, once upon a time, a long time ago, was the king of the gods, before he was overthrown by his own son Zeus in a cataclysmic divine war between father and child, and then condemned to wander this desert, with the Temple of Pandora chained to his back. And Pandora's Temple is a vast, sprawling, labyrinthine, mountain-sized dungeon filled with deadly traps and sinister puzzles, and at the center of it all awaits our goal, Pandora's box, which holds the power to kill a god, so that Kratos can finally slay his nemesis Ares, the god of war. So he plunges into the desert sands, climbs the back of the Titan, avoids every trap and solves every puzzle of the old temple complex, and becomes the first mortal to ever kill a god, becomes a legend, and not for glory, not even really for vengeance, but to be finally free of his guilt, of the horrible visions which haunt him. This is one of the coolest journeys in any fantasy video game ever. I've been racking my brain for a better adjective, but at the end of the day, it's just freaking cool, man. Pandora's Temple is one of my all-time favorite fantasy locations in any media ever. It feels so ancient, so insane, and so unique. Even now, all these years later, there's nothing else quite like it. God of War brought the setting of mythological Greece to life in a very spectacular and original way, to the point where, even if it didn't have such a good combat system, it should still be remembered as one of the great adventure games of its generation. But, of course, on top of all of that, it also had an amazing combat system, and we have to talk about that too. So in this video, I do not want to just do the typical retrospective thing, where we follow the game from start to finish and I just list off everything that happens in the game. I want to dig deeper. Something that interests me is identity. How did God of War define itself in the video game landscape of its day? How did it both borrow from and differentiate itself from other games available at the time? Let's look at some other fantasy action-adventure games that were out on the PlayStation 2 when it was released. For example, Ico. If you are not familiar, Ico was an early PS2 game made by the same people who later developed the much more popular Shadow of the Colossus, which coincidentally released the same year as God of War. 2005 was a pretty good year for games. Anyway, in Ico you play as this young boy, lost in an ancient, crumbling, sprawling, and mysterious castle, and the gameplay is mostly made up of a mix of exploration and puzzle solving, with a little bit of very clunky combat on the side. And while, on the surface, Ico and God of War may seem like very different games in tone and style, and certainly in combat, other aspects of the design are extremely similar. For example, the kind of environment you are exploring. a big puzzle-filled dungeon. The ways in which you navigate that environment, by climbing up handholds and sidling along ledges and jumping on ropes, and so are the kinds of puzzles you are solving. In both games, a lot of the puzzles involve pushing a big heavy block somewhere so you can move forward, or navigating around some hazard in the environment. And so, despite all their surface level differences, the actual gameplay, the boy Ico exploring this castle and Kratos exploring Pandora's temple, are nearly identical at times. What I'm trying to show by this example is that God of War was, in some ways, a very typical, very ordinary, even very generic fantasy action-adventure game for its time. It was following in the footsteps of a lot of similar games that had come before. It was doing the same things, but with way more spectacle and cinema and bombast than its competitors. And of course that includes the Legend of Zelda series. This is a comparison I'm going to keep making, because at the time Legend of Zelda was definitely the gold standard of action-adventure games. Ocarina of Time practically created the 3D action-adventure genre. And again, in a lot of ways, these games are very similar. I've always thought of God of War as kind of being like Zelda but with blood, or Zelda but with boobs. So many boobs. I think God of War must hold some kind of record for most bare, naked nipples in a video game. It was very exciting for a young man, let me tell ya. This was not a game you wanted to play when your parents were around, though it also makes this a very time-consuming video to edit for YouTube, because the boobs are everywhere. Half of every female character you meet has got her tatas hanging out. A ton of the monsters have got big old polygonal fun bags out on display. There was even a sexual intercourse minigame, which was crazy. Sex in a video game, oh my goodness. And I used to think this minigame was completely stupid and juvenile, nothing but pointless titillation for teenage boys, and it definitely is all of those things. But on my most recent playthrough while preparing for this video, my opinion has changed somewhat. This does have a narrative purpose. It does develop Kratos' character in an important way. The only physical intimacy with another human being he is ever shown to have in the whole course of the game is this totally soulless and emotionless encounter, where he looks completely unhappy both before and after, and where he clearly does not care at all about the people he is with. It's just sex for sex's sake. It shows how emotionally empty his life is, how alone he is, how little he has left to live for. But getting back to my discussion of how God of War was defining itself at the beginning of the series, all of the gratuitous, extreme violence and explicit nudity was a huge part of that identity. God of War was marketed as a mature game for mature gamers. This wasn't one for the casuals. This wasn't a game for those little kiddies and their Mario and their Pokemon and their Zelda. This was a game for the hardcore gamers who wanted blood and boobs and sex. If you go back and read old reviews, they talk about how, oh yeah, mature gamers are sure eating good with this one. No mature gamer is gonna be disappointed by God of War. Which sounds so silly now because our definition of what makes a video game mature has changed so much in the past 2 decades. The new Norse God of War games are definitely mature, not because of their violence or their number of naked boobies, but because of the story, because the themes are so serious and so relevant to issues that actual adults in the real world face. Like how to be a good father, how to raise your children to be empathetic, how to guide your children to avoid the mistakes you made when you were growing up. Nowadays, the obsession in the old games with explicit violence and nudity actually feels kind of childish by comparison. With that said, I find all the guts and boobs to be really charming, and I do think that games like God of War were important to the progress of the industry as a whole. We needed developers who were willing to prominently display violence and nudity in their games, at a time when it was still considered controversial, when doofus talking heads on the daytime news were still getting outraged over the mere idea of sex being mentioned in a video game. Like, oh my goodness, think of the children. We needed games like God of War to go to an extreme, to break this public perception that video games were nothing more than toys for children. We needed games like this one to say, no, this was not made for kids. And of course, it was not the first or the only video game to do this. Mortal Kombat was already doing the same thing a whole decade earlier. God of War was merely a small part of a larger transformation in the perception of video games and their place in our culture, even if it does seem kind of silly or crass to a contemporary audience. Next, let's do a deep dive into the game's combat system. Kratos wields a very unique weapon, two burning swords grafted to the flesh of his arms via chains. They are very versatile, very dynamic, and have a very long range. In battle, he swings them around his body in these quick, wide, sweeping arcs, so he is not just facing off against one enemy at a time, but instead able to fend off 5, 10, even 15 enemies all at once. God of War was famous for having very long combos. Like if you were good at the game, which I'm not by the way, but if you were good at it, you could unleash these 100, 200 move combos where the character just keeps swinging and swinging his swords in these complicated arcs, tossing enemies into the air, slamming them down into the ground, pulling off these crazy moves without ever once getting interrupted. And even if you suck at the game, you can still regularly pop off like 30 or 50 part combos, because God of War's combat system is very easy to get into. It was intuitive. It made you feel like an action hero in a movie, pulling off crazy cinematic stunts at the press of a button. This was a time when a lot of other video games still felt really clunky and janky to play. Fluidity was not the standard. Like I already mentioned Ico before, which has a terrible, awful combat system that was not fun to deal with even back then and has not aged well since. Or another example, Resident Evil 4, easily the greatest action horror game of that generation, or possibly of any generation, also released on the PlayStation 2 the same year as God of War. Again, 2005, a great year for games. And Resident Evil 4's combat feels far stiffer and clunkier than God of War's. To say that the fluidity and ease of its combat system blew all of those other games out of the water is a vast understatement. It's like comparing an old lady with a walker in a grocery store to a freaking spaceship rocketing through the center of the sun. God of War was years ahead of its time, and it has aged very well. It still works. It is still fun to play. There was a level of intensity to God of War's combat that was missing from a lot of other games. In God of War, you are constantly outnumbered, constantly outgunned, and constantly surrounded. Every single fight is its own individual desperate struggle. Every group of enemies felt dangerous. They all had the potential to kill the player. God of War was difficult. Like I said earlier, it was advertised as a hardcore game for hardcore gamers. It refused to hold your hand or take it easy on the player, especially towards the latter half of the game and on higher difficulties. It is going to kick your ass. You are going to die, which is interesting because this is something the series has dropped over time. Every new God of War game felt a little easier than the one that came before, and the Norse titles especially feel like they were developed with a more mass audience in mind. It's not just for the hardcore crazy sickos anymore. Outside of some post-game optional boss battles, I do not think of either God of War 4 or Ragnarok as being particularly challenging games. And another core element of God of War's combat system was the spectacle. It looked so cool. Kratos' chainswords are constantly creating these huge explosions on the ground, or lighting on fire, or swinging around in these intricate flashy patterns. The animation work and the effects were superb for their time. I said this in another video before, but at times playing God of War really felt more like watching an action movie than it did like playing an action video game. It was so cinematic, not in the cutscenes, but in the moment-to-moment gameplay. I had never seen anything like it before in a video game. The game also had a simple magic system. You could drop massive shockwave attacks, or unleash a storm of angry souls, or turn enemies to stone. The first game probably has my favorite magic in the series. It is very basic, but also very effective and straightforward. Later games tried to get a bit fancier or a bit more technical with the spells, but I've always preferred the simple, direct magical attacks of the first game. With all of that said, we have to ask the question, is there anything in the combat system of the original game that has not aged well? And yeah, of course. After all, this game is 20 years old. Not everything holds up. For example, the camera has some problems. You will frequently get hit by enemies that are off screen. The button prompts do not always work properly. Like, whenever enemies get stunned, you are supposed to hit the circle button to grapple them, but I swear to God, this mechanic only functions like a third of the time. The other 2/3 of the time, when you press that circle button, Kratos will try to grab literally anything else on the screen besides the thing you are trying to grab. Like, just look at this stupid doofus refusing to grab the giant ogre that is right in front of him here. The dodge roll mechanic is also kind of stiff and controlled by moving the joystick instead of the standard button press of newer games, so not as accurate as I'd like it to be. The parry mechanic is a bit shoddy. It is often not entirely clear which attacks you are able to parry and which ones you cannot, though the parry does feel much stronger in this first game than it did in the sequels. It is a very quick time event heavy game too, and this is one of those areas where it really starts showing its age. God of War was released smack dab in the middle of the golden age of QuickTime events in big budget video games, or maybe the not so golden age depending on what your opinion of them is. Developers used QuickTime events to allow the player to participate in these heavily scripted cinematic movie moments in games. For example, Resident Evil 4 had a lot of them as well. They have since fallen out of favor. Nowadays, developers prefer to give the player more control over these types of encounters, instead of just watching a cutscene and occasionally pressing a button to progress. The problem is that they are not very interactive. The newer God of War games use them pretty sparsely, usually for a cinematic finish and kill move, and they are never difficult to pull off. By contrast, the QuickTime events in the first God of War game are everywhere. They usually involve a long string of button presses, and they can be unforgiving. If you do not instantly press the button as soon as it appears on screen, then you can just go screw yourself, dude. You are starting over. It also uses a lot of joystick-controlled QuickTime events, where you have to swing the control stick in a particular pattern, and these have never felt 100% accurate to me. I always thought they felt kind of wonky and imprecise, which in a game where any small mistake can lead to defeat can get pretty frustrating. However, even with all of that said, for a 20-year-old game, it holds up shockingly well and is still very fun to play today. The good far outweighs the bad here. Something else we need to discuss here are the boss fights. God of War is a franchise famous for its boss fights, which have a reputation for being epic in scale, brutal in their violence, and tough as nails in their difficulty. But something that may surprise you is that this reputation really developed in the sequels. The first game does not have very many boss fights, and the ones that are here really don't come anywhere close to matching the scale or the quality of the ones in the later games. This is another area where the first God of War really shows its age. This game only has 3 true boss battles. First, the Hydra at the very beginning of the game, which is still one of my favorites in the whole series. Second, the Minotaur in Pandora's Temple, which has not aged very well. It's kind of a clunky piece of crap of a fight. And finally, there is Ares at the end of the game, which in some ways is a very surprising fight, and in other ways is a huge pain in the ass. It is a massive difficulty spike even on lower difficulty settings. That first boss, the Hydra, is really the template for all of the great boss fights that came later in the series. It started the trend of every God of War game opening with some kind of crazy battle. The Hydra is massive in scale. I mean, at the time, I don't think I had ever seen a boss monster that came anywhere close to this size. It has at least 3 heads, and even the smaller ones are the size of an entire ship. And the big center one seems as big as a skyscraper. The fight itself is pretty simplistic though. The Hydra only has a couple of basic attacks which are easy to block or dodge, and it has an annoying tendency to spam this roar over and over, which does not do any damage but does knock you off this platform, so you have to climb back up again and again, kind of annoying. The Minotaur has a really cool design but is a bit tedious to actually fight. The battle comes in 3 parts. The first is a straightforward old-fashioned smash-off. Then you stun the Minotaur and have to engage in a long, quick-time event. And if you make a single mistake, you have to do it all over again. And finally, for the third part, if you nail the quick-time event, you have to turn around, run all the way to the other end of the arena, and pull this lever to shoot a log at the monster. You have to do this whole sequence 4 or 5 times in a row without any significant changes to the pattern. Back in the day, I remember thinking the Minotaur was really cool, but after replaying the game, it doesn't really hold up. It feels repetitive and too focused on quick-time events. Finally, there is the confrontation with Ares, which has some really fascinating ideas, but I'm going to save my discussion about that for a separate video. I plan on doing a whole other video breaking down his character, so if you really care, go check that out. The boss battles in God of War 2 and 3 and even the often criticized Ascension just get better and better. Next, let's talk about the world and level design. The Norse games are relatively open in their design. You cannot call them truly open world games, but they do have a kind of large, expansive hub area in the lake, or in the case of Ragnarok, multiple hub areas, that you can explore at your own pace, and that hub area is dotted with little dungeons and puzzles and side quests. It is actually similar to the world design of the older Legend of Zelda games, which were designed around a single large field, not big enough to be considered a true open world, but with enough freedom to give the player a sense of exploration and control over the adventure. By contrast, the first God of War's design is much more linear. For the first third of the game, you are following a single straight path forward, and once you have entered a new area, the door to the previous one often gets closed behind you, never to be seen again. This is because the first God of War had a lot more focus on action and on creating a scripted cinematic experience. Most of the second 2/3 of God of War are spent inside Pandora's temple, which on the surface can feel like a big Zelda-style dungeon, but when you dig a little deeper is actually very different in terms of level design. Legend of Zelda dungeons are like big jigsaw puzzles that fit together in very precise ways. Figuring out how rooms are connected together is part of the challenge. In Zelda, you will spend a lot of time examining the map and asking yourself, okay, how do I reach that room over there? By contrast, Pandora's Temple is much more linear. There is no map to examine here, and for the most part, the game will shuffle you from room to room, and it does not matter how those individual rooms are connected together, because as soon as you move on, you will never see any of those previous ones ever again. There are some exceptions to this rule. For example, Pandora's Temple is constructed around 3 consecutive rings, and there is a puzzle where you have to rotate those rings, rotate the entire mountain-sized temple, to line the rooms up in a specific way. It's a really cool puzzle. But for the most part, God of War is a much more linear kind of game. It feels closer in design to something like Ico or maybe the Sands of Time trilogy than it is to the Norse games or the Legend of Zelda series. Next, let's talk about the camera. And this is another design choice where God of War shows its age, because this game uses fixed camera angles. The player has absolutely no control over the camera at any time. If God of War were released today, it would never ever use fixed camera angles, or at least not for the entire game. They have totally fallen out of favor among developers of big budget games. They are very rare nowadays. If there is ever a full remake of the first God of War, it will not have fixed camera angles. I 100% guarantee it. It is just not how games are made anymore. And in some ways, it was already kind of an unusual choice for the original game. For example, Resident Evil 4, released that same year, had already made the transition away from the fixed camera angles of the previous games in that series into a more intimate, more immersive over-the-shoulder style, which both critics and players praised. So why did the developers of God of War choose to design their game around these already somewhat outdated fixed camera angles? Well, one reason is, as I've already discussed, God of War was intended to be a movie-like experience. It was supposed to feel like you were interacting with a film. The fixed camera angles are a huge part of that, creating these cinematic, exciting shots as you play, with burning cities or massive battles or whatever in the background. It also made the combat system possible. As I said earlier, you are often surrounded by 10 or even 15 enemies at a time, all of whom are attacking together, not waiting their turn. By pulling the camera up and away, players are able to see that entire group of enemies at once. Though it is not a perfect solution, you do still get hit by off-screen enemies fairly frequently. While they definitely do feel kind of stiff, I am someone who actually still likes fixed camera angles. I like the visual artistry that it can create at times. There's definitely a sense of photography and atmosphere and creative direction that these allow that cannot always be replicated by an over-the-shoulder angle. Anyway, let's move on to a discussion of the puzzles and platforming in the first God of War. Despite how much attention the action gets, while playing this first game, you are going to spend just as much time exploring, solving puzzles, and navigating elaborate platforming sequences as you will battling hordes of monsters, and particularly platforming. This first game has, by far, more platforming than any other game in the series, and it does not even come close. And oh my god, the platforming in this game sucks. It is so annoying sometimes. This is another spot where it really starts to show its age. While platforming, God of War feels like a 20-year-old game. I've spent a lot of time in this video talking about how fluid and fast and mobile the combat is, but the platforming is the exact opposite. The platforming is stiff and slow and clunky, and it is so unforgiving. As I mentioned earlier, this was designed to be a difficult game. It is supposed to kick your ass, and that applies to the entire game, not just the action. There are so many instant death spikes and saw blade filled platforming sections here where if you make one mistake, go screw yourself, dude. You are starting over from the beginning. The most famous and most frustrating of these sequences is by far the final level of the game. Towards the end of God of War, Kratos is killed and dropped down into the bowels of Hades. But he decides that he is not done yet. He begins clawing his way back up to the surface to complete his quest of vengeance. Almost the entire level is made up of very, very long, very difficult platforming sections. And pretty much all of them suck. The most egregious example are these tall vertical columns. They are perpetually spinning and covered in spikes. You gotta climb up these bad boys and you are in for a bad time. The problem is that the hit detection here is abysmal. If Kratos' little toe so much as looks at one of those spikes in the wrong way, your clunky slow ass is flying straight back down to the bottom. As a kid, I never got past this part of the game. It was just too hard and too frustrating for me. And now, as an adult, I still hate it. And this is only one example. These annoying platforming sections are all over the place in Pandora's Temple too. It just feels relentless in certain spots. Like this tightrope section full of spinning saw blades can be just as frustrating. I will say though that in preparing for this video, I have replayed the game about 4 times, and every time I play through it, I have less trouble with these. As you learn what the game expects of you and figure out the rhythm, it really does get easier. It is not fundamentally broken game design or anything like that, it's just really annoying. If you're watching the video right now, you should see me just flying up these columns. I'm actually kind of really proud of it. It is possible to master these parts of the game, and there is definitely something very satisfying about reaching the end of Hades. It really does make you feel like you've been through hell and conquered it. But that is not the only frustrating part of this game. A lot of the puzzles kind of suck too. One of the most common criticisms of the Norse games is that they hold the player's hand way too much during the puzzles. Atreus and Mimir have a habit of immediately shouting the solution at you before you even have a chance to solve the puzzle yourself. The first game in the series has the exact opposite problem. Sometimes it just does not give the player enough direction, and that was a common issue with games back then. It is not that any of the puzzles here are very complicated. As I mentioned earlier in the video, the puzzle design is very simple. It is mostly made up of pushing blocks around or navigating some kind of hazard or searching for a hidden entrance or lever. There's nothing here that is going to break your brain. It is just a lack of guidance. And even when you do know exactly what the game wants from you, it can still be frustrating, because a lot of these puzzles are based around really tight time limits, or instant death spikes, or endlessly respawning enemies, where any little mistake can force you to start over. One of the most famously frustrating puzzles in the game is this one. All you have to do here is push this block to the other side of the room before the spikes in the floor release. There is nothing complicated about it. The problem is that Kratos is the all-time slowest block pusher in the history of video games. This guy pushes a block across a smooth, flat surface at the same speed as a snail pushes a boulder up a mountainside. I swear to God, a baby with broken arms could push this block faster than he does. Luckily, he doesn't just push blocks, he can also kick them. Less luckily, powering up his kick is also really slow, and the distance the block travels after a kick is very inconsistent and difficult to time, which all leads to a lot of pain and frustration during a sequence like this one, which requires nearly pixel-perfect movements. In the sequels, the developers made the very smart decision to cut down on the amount of platforming, as well as the number of instant death traps, and also to focus the puzzles around more interesting ideas, like the time mechanic in God of War 2. This is another area where the series greatly improved over time. And you will notice that by the Norse games, the platforming has basically completely disappeared from the franchise. It is just not a part of the series' identity anymore. If there ever is a remake, I would be interested to see how the developers update these platforming and puzzle sections. How would you make the platforming smoother and less unforgiving while still maintaining the challenge? How would you make these puzzles more interesting or more creative? From a mechanical standpoint, the first God of War is a bit of a mixed bag by contemporary standards. On the one hand, I think the combat system has mostly aged extremely well. It is still a very fun game to play, and the overall adventure is still super duper cool. I still love exploring Pandora's Temple. On the other hand, the boss fights feel very tame and simplistic compared to what came later, and a lot of the platforming and puzzles have not aged very well either, though it is all perfectly playable. To be clear, a lot of the platforming and puzzles are completely fine. It is not as if every single puzzle is as annoying as pushing the block around the spike room, but there are enough irritating ones to drag down the overall experience. Next, let's talk about the story and Kratos as a character. And once again, I am going to make a comparison to the Legend of Zelda series. I am someone who grew up playing Nintendo games. Link, the protagonist of the Legend of Zelda series, is the ultimate goody two-shoes. There is never any internal struggle or conflict or angst. He always immediately does the right thing, no questions asked. He is happy and friendly and wants to help every stranger he meets. As far as I was concerned back then, that is what a video game protagonist was supposed to be. And so, when I encountered God of War and I saw Kratos for the first time, this angry, miserable, depressed protagonist who does not seem to care about doing the right thing, it was exciting for me. It felt new and different, even a little subversive. Kratos can be a challenging main character. He is never bad enough to be a villain, but also never quite good enough to be a hero. He does things that can make an audience feel uncomfortable. For example, when he pushes a trapped soldier into this execution chamber in order to complete this puzzle in Pandora's Temple. It is kind of horrifying. Of course, you could argue that he had to do that in order to complete his quest, that saving Athens from Ares' invasion is worth more than the life of a single man. But sometimes Kratos does terrible things for no reason at all. Like at the beginning of the game when he drops the boat captain down the throat of the Hydra. He could have easily saved this guy, he just chooses not to. Or later down in Hades when he stabs the same boat captain in the back. Again, there is no reason to do this, he is just being a jerk. And even when Kratos tries to do the right thing, he often fails. In the opening of the game, he comes across this locked door, and he can hear women being attacked by monsters inside. He tries to rescue them, but he arrives too late. They are already dead. In some ways, that is even more subversive than being an anti-hero. Kratos is a failed hero, a hero who does not arrive in the nick of time to save the day. At the time, I had never seen a character like that in a video game before. And unfortunately, that is something that gets kind of forgotten as the series progresses. It was not until much later that the writers remembered that Kratos is actually a character who wants to be a good guy. He is just so weighed down by his mistakes and his failures that he feels it is impossible for him to ever be better. And there was so much mystery in his story. The first time you played God of War, you didn't know who this guy was or what he had done or how he came to be this way. One of my favorite parts of the game is at the very beginning, when you are navigating these shipwrecks and you encounter this random NPC who, as soon as he sees you, locks himself behind a gate to protect himself, not from the rampaging monsters, but from you. He says, "I know who you are, I would rather die than be saved by you." And later there's a woman in Athens who flees in terror at the mere sight of Kratos. She would rather face the claws of the monsters invading the city than risk being anywhere near him. It makes you wonder, who am I playing as right now? What has this character done? He seemed so fascinating to me that first time I played that I had to keep going no matter how frustrating the puzzles or the platforming were so I could uncover his past. The game does a really good job of slowly drip feeding you information about his backstory, and every time you learn something new, it is something worse. It makes you question, do I really want to be role-playing as this guy? Can I still root for him after seeing all of the innocents that he has killed? And that is the point. He is supposed to be a challenging character. You should feel sympathy for the things that have been done to him, but at the same time, you should also feel revolted by the things he has done to others. And of course, the most important thing the story did was to set him up for his later journeys. To create a character who had done terrible things in his past, but who wanted to be better and had the strength to claw his way back out of the darkness eventually. Alright, those are all of the individual topics I wanted to cover in this video. My goal here was to explore what kind of video game landscape the first God of War was developed in, and how it set itself apart from those other games. Hopefully, now you understand how it was both years ahead of its time, but also a product of its time. It set the standard for every action game that followed, but it was also more than just an action game. It resembled a lot of other contemporary adventure games, but with a scale and spectacle far beyond what those other games had even attempted. Unfortunately, not everything has aged well, and the puzzles and platforming in particular feel pretty clunky nowadays. Going forward in future videos, we are going to examine how the identity of God of War transforms as the sequels are released, and also how the surrounding video game industry is transforming too. Pretty soon, other action games are going to begin catching up. First will come the triumphs of God of War 2 and 3, but by the time Ghost of Sparta and Ascension are released, the series will struggle to set itself apart from other games in the same genre. And then will come the great reinvention of God of War 4, when the franchise exploded back into mainstream relevance. I am really excited to continue this retrospective series, and I hope you are too. Before I end this video, I really feel like I should do a quick version of the usual retrospective thing, where we just follow the game from start to finish, so just in case you've never actually played it, I'll make sure you at least get to see all of the coolest and most frustrating parts of the first God of War. I wouldn't want you to miss out on anything here. So let's start at the start. God of War opens with a man standing on the edge of a cliff. He says only one thing: "The gods of Olympus have abandoned me. Now there is no hope." A lot of people make the mistake of assuming that the primary emotion driving Kratos' character is anger, but as we see here in the very first scene of the game, he is far more driven by sorrow than by rage. Here he expresses misery and depression, a feeling of hopelessness. However, that will change over time. Kratos becomes an angrier character in the sequels. And then, as the narrator tells us, Kratos cast himself from the highest mountain in all of Greece. After 10 years of suffering, 10 years of endless nightmares, it will finally come to an end. Death would be his escape from madness. But it had not always been this way. Kratos, we are told, had once been a champion of the gods. The words 3 weeks earlier appear on the screen, and next we see Kratos aboard a shipwreck in the Aegean Sea, battling against a horde of monsters. The entire story of God of War is one long flashback, all with the purpose of explaining why this man chose to throw himself off that mountain, to explain the source of his sorrow. The first level of the game takes place on board these shipwrecks. This is a whole fleet of ships that are being attacked by the Hydra, a massive multi-headed sea serpent. Kratos has been tasked by Poseidon, the god of the seas, with slaying the beast so that the waters of the Aegean can be made safe again. I'm not sure who these other smaller monsters are. I guess they're like friends with the Hydra or something. It doesn't matter. They mostly just serve as a tutorial to practice the game's combat system on. The sailors recognize Kratos, and none of them are very happy to see him. Kratos has a reputation. He is a famous and well-known figure in this world, but we do not yet know what he is famous for. But we can at least guess that it is not for something good. Some of these sailors are terrified of him, others are derisive. Kratos himself does not seem to care about the sailors at all. He never reacts to any of their deaths. He is portrayed as pretty callous and unfeeling here in this first level. He is here to do a job, and worrying about the fate of innocents is not a part of that job. From a gameplay perspective, I love this opening level. It is super duper cool. You cross from shipwreck to shipwreck as they are actively being destroyed by this massive creature. There are multiple spots where, as you are crossing a ship, one of the heads of the Hydra will smash through the hull and begin a mini boss battle. This opening does a fantastic job of setting the tone of this adventure. This game is going to be cinematic and exciting and brutal. The atmosphere is dark and grim. We also get our first block-pushing puzzle in this section, and our first glimpse of some of the clunkiness and irritation we are in store for with this game's puzzles. You have to push a wooden crate from one end of this deck to the other, while under constant arrow attack by these archer monsters. Not only do they attack Kratos, but they can also destroy the crate. The idea is to kick it at the right time to avoid the arrows, but it's pretty annoying. Don't love it. The whole opening sets the standard for the rest of the Greek series. Going forward, every single game is going to begin in a similar way, with a cinematic boss against some massive creature, full of spectacle and excitement, and the environment getting torn apart around you. These openings are just going to keep getting better and better, bigger and bigger, and flashier with each release. After defeating the Hydra and failing to rescue those women from the monsters, we get our first glimpse of Kratos' backstory. We are shown these brief, rapid flashes of extreme brutality and violence. We begin to get a sense of why those sailors were afraid of him, and why he is so miserable. He is plagued by nightmares of his past, from which he can never escape. The narrator tells us that he spends all of his time traveling by sea, from one port to another, completing the tasks the gods have set for him. But he never seems to get any closer to his true goal, which is to be free of the visions which haunt him. He has spent the last 10 years in the service of the gods, fulfilling their every request, in the vain hope that they will cure him of his nightmares. In the next scene, Kratos wakes up in his personal ship, in bed with some hot topless babes, nice, and has an argument with the goddess Athena. He demands to know why the gods have not fulfilled their promise to him, even though he has done everything they demanded of him. Athena says that he only needs to complete one final task. Her city, Athens, is under assault by Ares, the god of war. and his evil army of bloodthirsty monsters. She wants Kratos to kill the God of War, a seemingly impossible task. But if he can do this, then he will finally be free. Our first goal is to travel to the besieged and burning city and find the Oracle, who can supposedly reveal how to accomplish the impossible. It is unclear why Athena cannot just tell Kratos herself, but whatever. And this is where we get our first sexy mini-game. Press circle while standing in bed here and you get to bang a couple of hot topless babes. Nice! Of course, you don't actually see anything. The camera zooms in on this bit of pottery while some button prompts appear on screen, and the voice actress makes some silly high-pitched mouth noises. It only lasts about 20 seconds, so I guess I know him better than Kratos at least one thing, if you know what I mean. Moving on, if you thought the shipwreck level was impressive, boy, you ain't seen nothing yet. The second level takes place in the city of Athens, as it is being razed to the ground by Ares' army of monsters. It is a sprawling, crowded, urban battlefield of burning temples and shattered columns. The battle rages all around you. Every time you turn a corner, you will encounter another group of Athenian soldiers getting slaughtered by the minions of Ares. This is the level of the game which has by far the most spectacle. You can tell that the developers poured a ton of their resources into Athens to make it as cinematic and dramatic as possible. There are spots where you are climbing up the side of a burning building, and in the background you can see soldiers and monsters battling each other. And even further in the background, Ares himself, who is the size of a mountain, crushing entire buildings beneath his feet. As you explore the city, searching for the Oracle, you progress across war-torn ruined streets, platforming and climbing across shattered buildings, and battling groups of monsters. Ogres, minotaurs, harpies, cyclops, gorgons, all kinds of vicious creatures pulled straight out of the tales of Greek mythology. While battling monsters, there are a ton of random nameless Athenian civilians running around who can get caught in your attacks and killed. This was another thing that was totally shocking to me back when I first played the game. Like, oh my gosh, he's just killing random innocent people. In Kratos' defense, these Athenians were already completely brain dead even before he killed them. They will literally run directly into your attacks. They apparently have no sense of self-preservation whatsoever. Eventually, you do find the Oracle you've been searching for, and ayo, she's got her big old tatas hanging out. Nice. Unfortunately for her tatas, she gets dragged away by a pair of harpies, who then dangle her from this rope, just for the fun of it, I guess. There's a platforming sequence where you have to jump and climb around this room before she loses her grip. And then it is the Oracle who, by reaching into Kratos' memories, reveals the first chapter of his past. That he was once a brutal Spartan general who led a vicious campaign of conquest across Greece. The Oracle openly questions why Athena would send someone like him to save the city. She explains that the only way to defeat Ares is to acquire the power to kill a god that was sealed inside Pandora's box. And to do that, Kratos has to travel across the desert, climb the Titan, explore Pandora's temple, yada yada yada. I already talked about all that. The next level takes place in the lower portion of Pandora's temple, and this is by far my favorite part of God of War. The temple feels so ancient and so mysterious and so dangerous. I love the outdoor portions especially, where you can see this vast landscape in the background as the Titan Kronos continues his slow wandering across the earth. The temple is very dense with content. Every single chamber has a new battle against a group of monsters, a new platforming section to traverse, a new puzzle to solve. There's a ton of variety in the enemies and challenges. I know I've already said this a dozen times and you're probably sick of hearing me repeat myself, but seriously, I love Pandora's Temple. There is some backstory you can unravel as you explore too. The temple was designed by a man named Pathos Verdes III, and you can find messages he left for future challengers throughout the temple. At first, Pathos describes himself as a loyal servant of the gods, but then the incredibly complicated construction, easily the most ambitious project ever attempted by man, begins to consume his entire life. One by one, his family is destroyed, his sons killed in accidents, his wife driven mad by grief until he has nothing left but the temple itself. As his own mental state collapses, the construction becomes more and more twisted, the puzzles more dangerous, and the traps more vicious, until it reaches a point where even Pathos himself is unsure whether it is possible to survive the nightmare he has engineered. In the very final chamber of the temple, you can find his long-dead corpse. His story serves as a warning of how the gods repay those mortals who serve them. Unfortunately, it is a warning Kratos does not heed. Just like Pathos, he too is destined to be driven to madness by his service to the gods. The story of Pathos Verdes III is one of the grimmest in the whole series. Anyway, back to the gameplay. The lower portion of Pandora's temple is broadly divided into 3 challenges, each dedicated to a different god. The first is the challenge of Atlas, which is the simplest and most straightforward of the 3. Not much to talk about here. The second is the challenge of Poseidon, and this is where things start to get interesting. The most frustrating section here is the battle against these 3-headed fire-spitting Cerberus dogs. These creatures not only have a ton of health and take forever to kill, but they also constantly spawn smaller versions of themselves, and if you do not immediately kill the new spawns, then they can grow to full size and then spawn even more Cerberus dogs. If you don't move quickly enough, it is very easy to get trapped in an infinite loop of endlessly respawning enemies and overwhelmed. Personally, I find it to be one of the hardest fights in the whole series, especially on higher difficulties. The most memorable puzzle here is definitely the Chamber of Sacrifice. You have to push this poor trapped Athenian soldier up this sloped floor, while being attacked by endlessly respawning enemies, kind of annoying. And then at the top you shove him into the sacrificial burning altar thing. It is one of the most brutal puzzles in the series, but as we will see in the sequels, there is a lot of competition for that title. And of course, being dedicated to the sea god Poseidon, this challenge also involves a lot of underwater portions. A lot of dodging spinning saw blades while swimming through submerged tunnels. Pretty cool. Finally, the third is the challenge of Hades, which is definitely the hardest section of the game up to that point. This challenge includes this very long fight against respawning centaurs. Then you've got this platforming section where you have to navigate these tight ropes while dodging saw blades. Very easy to make a minor mistake and fall to your death here. The challenge of Hades also contains the boss battle against the Minotaur, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a very tedious and long fight. On higher difficulties, it can become a serious test of endurance. And finally, there is this room filled with Indiana Jones-style giant rolling boulders, and you have to open doors looking for the exit while dodging the boulders. Remember when I talked about how slow Kratos is at pushing blocks? Well, guess what? He is even slower at opening doors. Anyway, after completing all 3 challenges, you reach what is probably the coolest puzzle in the whole game. You have to rotate the entire mountain-sized temple to line up this beam of light to unlock an elevator at the center of the complex, which will take you to the upper portion of Pandora's temple, which is known as the Cliffs of Madness. This is where the difficulty really ramps up. The enemies are replaced with tougher versions of themselves with way higher health and damage. Some of the most difficult and most annoying puzzles in the game are located here, like the one where you have to push the block through the spike room that I discussed earlier. Throughout all of this, Kratos' backstory is slowly revealed. You'll learn through flashbacks that, during his time as a Spartan general, he was once overwhelmed by a barbarian horde. But just before he was defeated, he called on Ares, and pledged himself to the god of war in exchange for victory. It was Ares who grafted the magical fire blades into his flesh as a mark of his enslavement. In the service of the god of war, Kratos' violence reached new horrific heights. Ares tasked him with burning down villages and slaughtering innocents by the hundreds, and Kratos willingly carried out these bloody missions without any hesitation whatsoever. He transformed into a monster. This continued until he was tricked into committing an unthinkable act, into murdering his own wife and daughter. Afterwards, he was forever cursed, and the ashes of his dead family's bodies were permanently bound to his flesh, transforming him into the ghost of Sparta. Pretty gruesome. It was at that moment, as he gazed upon the corpses of his family, slain by his own hand, that he realized what he had become, and swore revenge against Ares. He has been working in the service of the other Olympians ever since. It is during these revelations that the player may begin to wonder, who is the more terrible monster here? The genocidal god of war who set all these events into motion in the first place, or his equally vicious former servant, who never once questioned all the heinous things he was ordered to do? Anyway, back to the temple. If you manage to defeat every monster, solve every puzzle, and overcome every challenge in this twisted dungeon, you will be rewarded with Pandora's box. Unfortunately, before he has a chance to open it, Kratos is killed by Ares and cast down into the underworld. But as will become a recurring theme throughout the series, even the fires of hell are not enough to contain Kratos' thirst for vengeance. He claws his way back to the surface in that series of extremely long and difficult platforming sequences I described earlier. He actually only escapes from Hades with the help of this mysterious gravedigger, who is somehow able to dig a hole all the way down into hell and drop an escape rope from which Kratos climbs to freedom. Of course, the gravedigger will later be revealed to be Zeus, king of the gods and ruler of Mount Olympus. In the next game, he will become the arch-villain of the trilogy, but for now, Zeus is just trying to help out. In the final level of the game, we return to Athens to discover that, while we were exploring Pandora's temple, the city has been utterly destroyed by Ares' invasion. There is no sign of life left anywhere. Even the oracle who sent you on your quest is dead. Once again, Kratos is portrayed as the hero who arrives too late to save anyone. Even when he does everything right, even when he manages the impossible, it makes no difference. Next is the final battle, the confrontation with Ares, which I am not going to discuss in this video. As I mentioned earlier, I will post a separate video examining the big bad villain. When the fight is over, when against all odds the god of war is slain at the hands of Kratos, Athena reveals the truth. She never had any intention of fulfilling her promise to him. He cannot be cured of his nightmares. Even the gods do not have the power to absolve him of his crimes. The story finally catches up to the first scene of the game, with him throwing himself off the highest mountain in all of Greece. Now we understand why he has lost all hope. However, at the very last moment, just as he is about to die, he is rescued by Athena, who offers him godhood and the newly vacant position of god of war as a sort of consolation prize. As Kratos takes his seat upon his new throne on Mount Olympus, the credits roll, displaying a series of images that tell the entire future history of warfare and battle on the planet Earth, all the way up to the 2 world wars of the 20th century. All of it overseen by the new god of war, Kratos, the legendary mortal who became a god. It is an awesome way to conclude the story, and if the series had ended here, I think God of War would have been remembered as a classic action-adventure title, one of the best of its generation. But of course, as we all know, the series did not end here. This became only the first of 9 games so far. The original God of War created a template which continues to be iterated upon and improved upon to this very day. And eventually, no matter how long it takes, I am going to do deep dives into every single one of those 8 sequels, to see how each of them either built upon or changed the formula established in this first release. So if that is something you're interested in, then please stick around.